Today we're going to talk about adaptation. The process of taking a work from one medium and converting it to another has gone on for centuries. Myths become novels, novels become plays, plays become films, and films become commemorative bath towels or erotic fan fiction. Now, adapting a work between mediums is never an easy task. You have to preserve the core of what was in the original work while still playing to the strengths of the medium you're adapting it to. If you fail to capitalize on the strengths of your medium, you end up aping whatever superficial elements of the original that you can. The visual style or the narrative might be the same, but the soul of the work is lost. On the other hand, if you take too many liberties, you've sort of lost the point of an adaptation, and the name association feels like a cheap sales trick or an attempt to associate yourself with another, better work. Which, by the way, is why I'm declaring that this video series is officially my attempt to adapt Hamlet to a modern audience. I was going to make it an adaptation of Total Recall, but I had trouble finding a three-breasted lady who was willing to go topless. Anyways, as complicated as adaptations are in any medium, they seem to suffer particularly badly in the medium of video games. We're a young art form and haven't quite come to grips with what our strengths are, let alone how to leverage them properly in an adaptation. With that in mind, let's take a look at 3 different games that adapt their source material in 3 different ways. But keep in mind that I'm not really looking at whether or not these are good games, but whether or not they're good adaptations of their source material. Ghostbusters is a wonderful example of how most film-to-video game adaptations play out. First of all, if there's one thing that games are genuinely good at adapting, it's visual and sound design, and in that regard, this game is amazing. From the Law & Order font of the logo, to the growl of a proton pack as it activates, to the layout of the Ghostbusters headquarters, this game looks and sounds the part of a canonical Ghostbusters experience. Surprisingly, this is especially true of the characters returning from previous films. Venkman looks like Bill Murray.
He gets a cool title, too?
Ray looks like Dan Aykroyd.
It means he gets to carry around a bunch of untested, extremely dangerous hardware that, if not handled correctly, could blow him somewhere into New Jersey.
They even managed to get Harold Ramis right.
Say, is that him?
It's hard to miss.
The problem is that while the audio and visuals are clearly from Ghostbusters, the core gameplay structure isn't. At its core, the original Ghostbusters is about a downtrodden bunch of misfits who get kicked out of academia and are forced to start a business for themselves.
I believe that we were destined to get thrown out of this dump.
For what purpose?
To go into business for ourselves.
The first half of the film is their rags to riches story, starting as discredited charlatans, but eventually becoming successful and famous. The second half of the film is the Gozer plot, presenting the Gozerian as a big bad, but introducing government regulation as the evil that heralds its arrival. The movie is sort of a love letter to small business. I mean, yeah, there's proton packs and there's ghost hunting, but the core of the film is really about 4 guys who go from laughingstocks to saving the world by entering the private sector. And I'm not going to get into the second film because it's basically the exact same plot, as is Evolution. The developer, Terminal Reality, took this oddball comedy about entrepreneurship and technological exorcism and turned it into a linear third-person shooter? And I mean shooter. There are shotgun equivalents, machine gun equivalents, and missile launcher equivalents. I mean, yeah, sure, they're all given sci-fi names, but you tell me what this is doing.
You guys might want to stand back.
How far exactly?
Back. Way.
Instead of managing money and going from a small startup to a famous company, you're shooting boss monsters made of physics objects. Instead of dealing with government regulation and unhappy clients, you're shooting living candelabras. What I'm saying is that while the developers went to great lengths to make sure that the game looked like Ghostbusters and sounded like Ghostbusters, in no way does this game even remotely play like Ghostbusters. Instead, it feels like they took a third-person shooter prefab and slapped their art and sound assets onto it. Really, there's only one mechanic that's novel and created just for the game, the idea of trapping.
Oh yeah? Come down here and say that.
And I've got to be honest, this is probably the one part of the game that comes closest to actually making you feel like a Ghostbuster. Once the ghost is weak enough, the proton pack switches over to its capture beam, which functions less like a laser gun and more like a lasso. I find this odd because that's all the proton pack ever seemed to do in the films.
Come on, fat boy! I'm gonna take you over to my side of the tube! You got him! You got him!
But anyway, you then have to throw out a trap and corral the ghost into it, occasionally slamming it against the walls to weaken its resistance. If the other team members help, it even becomes easier. There's something very satisfyingly Ghostbusters-y about wrangling a ghost into a trap as it tries to escape and cause more havoc.
Hey, keep pulling to the right! Okay, that's going in! No, take it! Hold it, Ray! Hit it!
Two in the box.
Ready to go.
We be fast and
They be slow.
Unfortunately, one mechanic does not an adaptation make, especially when so much of it is just mindless shooting. If a no-thrills third-person shooter is what we think can pass as an acceptable adaptation of Ghostbusters just because they use proton packs, I think I'll pass on the Caddyshack golf game or the Stripes RTS. Let's move up a notch on the adaptation scale and take a look at Alien vs. Predator. And, well, take a look. Rebellion Studios also does their part to prove the games are quite capable of adapting franchise visually and aurally. It's hard not to think about the Aliens or Predator franchises when looking at this footage. And at least now, instead of a screwball comedy with action trappings, we have not one, but two action horror films to pull from. Surely systemizing this has got to be easier than systemizing this.
My parents left me that house. I was born there.
You're not going to lose the house. Everybody has 3 mortgages nowadays.
But at 19%, you didn't even bargain with the guy.
Ray, for your information, the interest rate alone for the first 5 years comes to $95,000.
I mean, at least there are some clear, visceral mechanics you can make a game out of now, right? Well, yes and no. First of all, unlike Ghostbusters, effort was clearly put into adapting game mechanics from the source material. Each species was given its own flavor of gameplay with inspiration taken directly from the films. Aliens are an agile, weak, melee-based class that can walk on walls and hide in the shadows. Predators have all the visor modes, cloaking, and high-powered space weaponry you'd expect from a crab-faced alien on a safari. And Space Marines are motion tracker-equipped roughnecks, toting giant machine guns and swearing all the time.
Bugs, androids, invisible snipers, welcome to the fucking Corps.
Did anyone else just hear the squirrel from SpongeBob SquarePants?
Bugs, androids, invisible snipers, welcome to the fucking Corps.
Anyways, the low-level mechanics do manage to systemize bits and pieces from the films in ways that Ghostbusters shooting mechanics simply didn't even try. The problem arises not at this low level of immediate mechanics, but at a higher level of design. You see, these species-specific abilities are all used to navigate a rather uninventive and painfully constrained first-person shooter game. The general structure of every level is basically this. Step 1. Walk into the next room. Step 2. Kill everything in that room. Step 3, repeat. It doesn't matter if you're an alien, a human, or a predator. All of the levels play identically. Stop and think about what this means for each species. Instead of a noble hunter out for the hardest-earned trophy, the predator is now gunning down every grunt who happens across his path. The alien is no longer a creature that kidnaps humans to grow its hive and kills just to feed, but is rather a cartoony movie monster genociding the entire human race. And all of the tension and terror and horror of being a human stuck between these two warring alien factions is sort of sucked away as you mindlessly slaughter countless aliens and predators. It'd be like adapting an Indiana Jones game, and while some superficial elements may be present, like a whip or a gun or a toggleable fedora, the whole point of the game isn't to find some sort of ancient treasure, but rather just to do nothing but shoot Nazis. Actually, come to think of it, I think they have made this game. Aliens vs. Predator's main flaw is that Rebellion started with a standard first-person shooter formula and then slapped on some low-level mechanics after the fact. In effect, this isn't really an Aliens vs. Predator game, it's really more of an Aliens vs. Predator total conversion for a prefab first-person shooter game. Finally, we have Batman Arkham Asylum. And just like Ghostbusters and just like Aliens vs. Predator, we have a game that looks exactly like its source material and sounds exactly like its source material, right down to hiring the voice actors from Batman the Animated Series.
Tell me something. You've never let me catch you this easily. What are you really after?
Oh, nothing much. Hundreds dying in pain and fear. All their meaningless lives brought to a horrifying conclusion.
You don't get much more official sounding than that Batman voice.
Where were the other drugs going?
Yet no Christian Bale, we're going with the animated series cast on this. Thank you.
What?
Sorry.
Why?
Because you sound less like a superhero and more like a 50-year-old lady who smoked too many menthol lights after gargling chloric acid? Don't cry. Oh, poor baby. So yes, it looks and sounds the part. It also has tons of low-level mechanics straight out of the Batman canon. You can throw batarangs at enemies, glide long distances using your cape, and use a grappling hook to hop across the rooftops and ledges. What really sets Arkham Asylum apart is that the game, and I mean the whole game, is designed to be a Batman game. This isn't a Half-Life first-person shooter or a God of War style beat-em-up where the weapons just happen to be batarangs. In this game, every mechanic is designed to reflect either on Batman himself or his relationships with some of his enemies. For example, the entire combat system is based around one man fighting a team of enemies in order to build up a combo meter. To be proficient at building up your combos, you need to be reading enemies ahead of time and using their own moves against them. This feels a lot closer to the martial arts Batman uses than, say, a God of War style beat-em-up would have felt. And that's when there's any combat at all. Batman does plenty of slinking around in the darkness, slowly stringing up and taking down enemies from the shadows.
Hey, get off me!
Zaz is down, but not for long.
There's also a detective mode to further explore Batman's mental faculties, technological advantages, and reputation as a world-class crime solver.
I can follow traces of alcohol from Frank's bourbon in the atmosphere. Oracle, I've got a trail.
That's great. You follow it. I'm grabbing every reference to Arkham I can find. Maybe useful later.
So using these mechanics, they've established Batman to be a competent fighter, but one that prefers to solve problems with critical thinking and stealth if at all possible, which sounds like Batman to me. What about his rogues gallery? Well, for one, the Riddler leaves all sorts of mental puzzles, brain teasers, and hidden objects to find all throughout the asylum.
What silent killer of the oceans can be found in a tiny jar? You are performing just below my predicted expectations.
There are entire scenes dedicated to Scarecrow warping Batman's perception of reality.
Mom?
Help us, Bruce. Don't let us die.
And there are boss fights with Bane, Killer Croc, and others that highlight the old superhero trope of a truly powerful supervillain. And it does all of this in an open environment that encourages players to look at these different facets of Batman at their own pace. In short, Arkham Asylum uses its mechanics to delve into every aspect of Batman's abilities and his relationship with his enemies in a way that only games can provide, without the hard constraints of a traditional genre. If you're going to adapt a work from one medium to another, you have to understand the strengths of that medium. You can't adapt a property to film without thinking about how it's going to look or sound. And, in a similar vein, you can't adapt a property to a video game without thinking about how it's going to play. It's ironic that for all the effort developers put into recreating the source material through sound design and visual design, that they don't put more effort into recreating the source material through game design. But they have reasons for falling back on tropes like shooters and racing games. First, we know that they work, and the risk-averse games industry is keen to focus on that. It's hard for any $40 million game to introduce substantially experimental mechanics, whether it's an adaptation or not. Second, game adaptations usually don't happen the way they do in other mediums. No one starts by reading a great book, thinking up a game idea based on the book, writing a design doc, and then pitching it to publishers. Instead, publishers acquire currently hot properties like, say, Harry Potter, then demand a quick turnaround from developers for a synergistic launch at the same time as the movie. The games industry treats them more as supplementary merchandise to the films instead of creative endeavors in their own right. Finally, I don't think the games industry respects itself as a creative medium enough. Mechanic design is as core to games as composition is to music and cinematography is to film, but too often it's just seen as the glue to hold a bunch of cutscenes together that were done better in the film to begin with. I mean, do you really want to sit through 45 minutes of this? To watch this?
I've tried everything, MJ. He just won't listen. He's convinced I killed his dad.
But he's your best friend, Peter. Deep down, he has to know you'd never do anything to hurt him.
And until the games industry and its audience decides to care more about the art of mechanic design, that's what's going to pass for an adaptation.